Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, Drew, thank you for joining me today on the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's good to connect with another Canadian.
I know, right? Somebody, yes. Well, as you said, there's not, Ontario's a bit flatter than Alberta when it comes to epic mountain ranges. But remind me, you were in Alberta for how long before moving to the States?
Oh, so I grew up there. So I was born in a little town called Eiley. I spent my early childhood in Fort McMurray and then grew up in Red Deer. I think I was like 6 when we moved to Red Deer. And then I was 22, 23 when I moved to the States. But now, as you can hear, and I get told this every time I go home, I sound like a Southern politician. I've totally lost my Canadian accent because I've been down here like 22, 23 years.
We'll work to reconvert you, work on your outs and abouts and house.
Isn't there some software you could run my voice through to make it more Canadian?
Hey, potentially. It's outside the budget at the moment, but maybe next time we chat.
Someday.
Well, speaking of living in the United States, so I know you've called a few different places in the States home. Now you're in Portland. Are you technically a Portlander? Is that a thing, or is that just super nerdy?
A Portlander?
Yeah.
A Portlandier? I don't know what the proper terminology is, but I'm actually it's funny. I'm actually across the border from in Washington State, but I'm only 15 minutes from Portland. So
okay.
It's actually a suburb of Portland, but it's weird because it's in a different state. So yeah, and I've spent a lot of time here because when I first moved down to the States, I came to Portland. My wife grew up in the area. So I feel like not quite a native, obviously, but I've logged 12 years here altogether. And we love it. We love it. It's, as you know, it's beautiful. And weird, right? That's Portland's motto, is keep Portland weird. And I'm trying to keep it more normal. I'm out here in the suburbs driving a minivan and
doing your best. Doing
my best, but I think I'm losing.
I growing up on the mission field, there's a woman who is just so full of life. And she would say, deep down inside, everybody's exceptionally weird. It's just that some people are better at hiding it than others. And I'm like, I think that I can live by that. That's so true. So wait, keep Portland weird. Well, here's the thing I was curious to know was I've heard it said and then contested that the best coffee in the world is produced in Portland. Obviously, often it's grown other places, but I want to know when it comes to coffee shops, different genres of coffee flavors, what's your is Portland the best place in the world? Do you agree or disagree?
The rumors are true. I'm not like a connoisseur. Of course, I love coffee, but yeah, what's a great shop here? Heart Coffee is pretty amazing, pretty hoity-toity, and for the real snobs that know what they're talking about, they drink it like wine. They're like,
this was grown on the foothills of the Andes in Chile.
Right. You can get just hints of, But yeah, I'm not a coffee snob, but I do appreciate coffee. But here's the sacrilege. This is what, they could almost push me out of this area for. I still drink Starbucks about half the time. So even though
sacrilegious.
Yeah, it is, because it's not, it's the big corporate thing. But hey, let's be honest. Starbucks, Seattle, it's a Northwest thing. So
right. Yeah, I would have assumed that, but good to know. See, listeners are going to hate me for this. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I say to coffee drinkers, I appreciate that it's like God's grace to you in a cup. And so I just want to say God bless you in enjoying that. But I have frequented before I got married, I'd never been to Starbucks in my life. And then my wife got me onto chai tea lattes. So that's my one foray into Starbucks now. And
that's not a super manly vice, but that's okay.
Okay. I consider myself very cultured as a result, but clearly I am not. So all that to say, if you're in Portland, it's Heart Coffee.
Heart Coffee. Yep. If you're a coffee snob, you're in Portland. That's where you got to
go. Good. Yep. Well, friends, that's why we brought you on today. Drew, thanks for your time. We'll see you all next week. But no, on a service. Yeah, that's what we're here for. But on a little bit more serious note, as a resident of Portland, Portland's one of those places that's known as being a post-Christian part of the United States.
For sure.
Other people might point to places like New York City as just regions of the country where people would say, it really feels like Christianity is a thing of the past, and that many people are glad for it to stay that way, for it to be in the rearview mirror. And so, and you're welcome to run with us in any direction you want, Drew. But when you observe some of the cultural trends that you're experiencing in that context, especially among millennials and Gen Z, what would you say are some of the biggest implications for the spiritual future, not just of your region of the Northwest, but for the United States as a whole?
Yeah, I think there are big implications because, yeah, for better or for worse, the trajectory of the country, well, United States and Canada,
Right?
isn't rural areas. It's not
Mm,
the South, it's not Texas and places like that or the Bible Belt. The way the culture is trending is more like the Northeast, the Northwest, big cities along the coast. And Portland's certainly one of those, right? That is very clearly, I think you could say, post-Christian in many ways. What's interesting to me is a lot of people thought, at least growing up in the church, it's like, okay, if people, go post-Christian, it means they become hardened atheists that are, just all about science. But it's so interesting. Like out here in Portland, it is very spiritual culture,
mm,
extremely spiritual, right? It's
mm,
post-Christian, but it's not that they're, just skeptical about supernatural claims. I think the best way to describe it would be neo-pagan. That's kind of the
mm.
the heart of Portland spirituality anyway. So when you talk to
Wow.
people, they'll have an array of odd beliefs. It's just that they are kind of postmodern in their view of the world, and so any sort of exclusive claims, which of course Christianity makes,
Right.
are highly offensive and objectionable. So I think that's an important thing to understand, though, because you dig into the numbers on people that claim no religion, and they are more likely than the rest of the population or religious people to believe in UFOs and Bigfoot and even things like reincarnation, all these supernatural things. And I
Hmm.
think that's important because a whole generation of Christians grew up with an emphasis on apologetics, which is good. You need that. But it reminds me of like a friend of mine, Dan Kimball. He's an author.
Hmm.
He does this thing where he distributes these like 5x3 index cards to people, to skeptics, and says, "Hey, write down your biggest questions and objections to Christian faith." And he's disseminated thousands of these. He's like, how many people have written, I just can't believe God exists, or did the resurrection really happen? He's like, zero. No one's asking that. Instead, they're
Really?
asking things like, well, how is Christianity the only way? Uh, or how did God command those wars in the Old Testament? Or
Mm.
is the Bible against women? You know what I mean? Or questions about sexual ethics. So
Hmm.
it's really it's important to understand the kind of zeitgeist of our times, and especially places like Portland, because I think this is kind of where the country or Western society in general is headed.
Hmm.
And so you need to learn how to speak in ways that they can understand and be heard without, of course, compromising your
Yeah.
beliefs. And that
Yeah.
is no easy feat.
So that's so intriguing, Drew, because I know when I've thought about gospel conversations, I'm thinking really a ton about, yeah, what are some of the compelling arguments surrounding the resurrection of Christ from the dead, for example. And so if I'm understanding you right, you're saying there's a real openness to some of those supernatural claims that the Bible has, but not, I feel like this is an oversimplification, but it almost seems like along certain social justice lines, like
Right.
topics like women's rights, war, just war versus unjust war, that people are wrestling. Why do you think that would be? Why do you think people that's what people, they say, this is the real sticking point for me?
Right. I think it's just it's the kind of goes back to, the broad umbrella term of postmodern philosophy, right? Which is animated by a concern for the marginalized. And that's actually a
Hmm.
good thing, right? Obviously, Christians were concerned about the marginalized, but
Yeah.
it's kind of the dominant morality of that worldview. And so if there's anything in your belief system that is perceived to be oppressive, that's a deal
Mm.
breaker. So when
Mm.
you're talking to people like that, and I'm no evangelism expert, but it's like, it's first of all, if you lead with your personal story, you talk about what Christians, call our testimony or something like that, and you talk about your experience with God, that is much less threatening. They'll be open to that, right?
Mm.
Because it's your narrative, it's your story, you own that, it's your truth, to
Right.
use the lingo of our time. And then if you can talk about what your faith community is doing for marginalized people, that will be
Right.
welcome as well. But if you start with the kind of like, okay, here's the big exclusive claims, you have to get to those eventually, but
Mm.
maybe you don't want to lead with those as much in an environment like this.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, and it's super helpful in those moments to consider how marginalized Jesus, well, at least his people group was at the time.
100%.
He was on earth. So
And the
that's
early
helpful
Christians,
though.
yep.
Like, thank you, because yeah, I want to be having those conversations, and many of our listeners do as well. So kind of continuing in that theme though, of considering the advent of post-Christendom in the West, we've seen statistically since, well, I think for a few decades now, we've seen a real decline in church attendance in the West, and those who would identify as Christians, and simultaneously this rise of the nones, people who are not only not attending church but not really identifying or affiliating with any religion, and obviously that being a big factor, kind of the point of the spear in this evolution of society towards being post-Christian. And so as you see Christianity kind of being pushed towards the cultural margins a bit, if you were to, yeah, try and look ahead and say, this is what the Western church is going to look like in 25 years. One, what do you predict is going to take place? But two, what would you say these are the traits, the qualities, the characteristics that resilient Christians are going to want to foster, or even that, the generation of individuals raising kids today is going to want to be intentional to foster in the lives of the next generation?
Yeah, man, those are good questions. We'll see if I have the gift of prophecy here.
Go for it.
Yes. Yeah. And the rise of the nuns, and I've said that before and then have to explain. I don't mean Catholic nuns. That'd be cool if there were like way more Catholic nuns running around, just like a huge explosion.
Taking on the
Unfortunately,
world, serving
yeah,
people.
that's not it. It's NONES, right? So yeah, people claiming no religion on the surveys. And it's interesting. So I wrote my first book about young people leaving the faith. And this was like 2010.
Was that hemorrhaging faith? Is that right? Remind me
No,
of the title.
Generation X Christian.
Thank you.
EX. It's a cute little play on words. Yeah.
I apologize. That was maybe Barna, probably David Kinnaman.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'll have to look it up later. Back to what you were saying.
No, yeah. And so, the only reason I bring it up is that I remember at that time, I was looking at the stats, and it was like 22% of young people, I think at the time, identified as having no religion, up from like 10% that was like 10 years before that. And a few scholars in this area objected to that when my book came out. They're like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's cherry picking stats. That was just a little blip and it'll go back down to 10%. That was just an anomaly and he shouldn't be citing that responsibly. It's, well, this is one case where I actually don't like being right, because now I think according to the latest like Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, that number is at about 40% for the younger generation. So it was not a blip. It was just the first little peak in a growing trend.
Right.
And I think this is like the first, Gen Z is the first majority non-Christian nation in American history. So it's definitely a trend. It's huge, and it's only, getting more pronounced. And then as far as like, obviously what that means for the future of the church, it's going to look very differently. Most scholars in this area see this persisting at least through the middle of the century. So bottom line is, in North America, we're going to, as Christians, have to occupy the margins in a culture in which we once occupied the center, right? Where Christianity was respected, where every town, it's like, oh, you got your doctor and a lawyer and a pastor, there was this kind of deference to Christians, even if you weren't a Christian. It's like, oh yeah, those are good people, the good book, like there was respect, and that's changing, unfortunately. But that just means it's going to be kind of back to New Testament times, where we're a little bit of a minority. I anticipate we'll get some persecution. I don't think we're quite there yet. I mean, people are pretty sensitive to persecution. Someone disagrees with you on Facebook and you think you're being persecuted, it's like, oh no. Maybe you need to go to China or Saudi Arabia, but yes, I do think it'll grow more pronounced to the point where it'll be hard to hold positions in public life if you're an outspoken Christian. And so I think, it's going to be a gut check. And I think to get to your answer, this is a long-winded way of saying it. what are the qualities of Christians that will be able to thrive in those circumstances? And it'll be like, I think it'll have a purifying effect on the faith. The people that are just kind of like, yeah, I'm a Christian because my grandma was Baptist, right? Like they'll be gone. There's
Yeah.
no cultural kind of gravity to draw you to that label of Christian. And you'll only identify as such if you really mean it. And you'll have to be an upstream swimmer and be willing to face a little persecution. And we'll have to be like the early Christians were. Very weird, very unique, clinging to the core doctrines of the Christian faith, and at the same time, very winsome, reaching out to people, showing compassion, showing love, and that'll be the way. And then at the same time, the global church, as you probably know,
Yeah.
Christianity is exploding in the global
Taking
south.
off.
And that's where the future is. The future is Africa. It's not America. The future is India, China, South America.
Yeah.
Where people are having 5, 6 babies each, whereas here we had a negative birth rate. So already I would say it's United States and certainly not Europe. They're no longer the centers of Christianity, and maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, in China, I think the estimates are between 180 and 200 million Christians, but it's hard to know, for
Right.
certain to track
So
that
many
down.
are in the underground church. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything, Drew, that you think, that you think will be easier for Christ followers to live out when they're not at the center of power? Is there anything that you would say, I think it's going to be easier to follow Jesus in this when you actually don't have tons of resources or don't have tons of cultural clout?
Yeah, I think it that cultural Christianity, which can be so toxic, will be less of a temptation. We saw this, Christianity is illegal for the first, few hundred years almost.
300 plus.
Yeah, until, what was it, the Edict of Milan, I think that.
I want to say 312.
Yeah. Hey, man, there's that church history knowledge
We'll
coming in.
Google it
I love
after.
it. Yeah. I was going to say 311. So either way, I'm pretty close.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that actually didn't make Christianity the state religion. It just reversed the illegality of Christianity. But anyway, the problem that Christianity encounters after that, right, is all of a sudden it's advantageous politically, culturally to be a Christian. So you got people that are like, yeah, I'm a follower of Jesus, and they're really not. They just want a better post or a better whatever.
Exactly.
And that's, of course, what creates monasticism, because these people are like, I need to be able to live a pure faith away from this nonsense. And we're not going to have that dynamic as much anymore, that kind of cultural Christianity. So I think that'll be good. And there will be just clearer demarcation between, quote unquote, the world and the church. And sometimes that can be a very good thing. So yeah, I think, and who knows, this is all subject to God's providence, right? There could be some massive revival that sweeps across, bring it, God, that'd be awesome. So who knows, but just looking at the stats right now, looking at the current trends, that's kind of where I see things going.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, over the last decade, we've seen, not only what we were just talking about, this increase in the nuns, this kind of movement in Western culture towards post-Christendom, but also just a ton of upheaval, right? Surrounding culture, politics, race, medicine, like faith, and more. People are like, medicine, just remember the vaccine. That's medicine. Maybe a few people were upset about that on different fronts. So in the midst of all that contestation, if you will, people going at each other about all kinds of different things, varying perspectives, wanting to claim the moral high ground for any number of things. And obviously that having implications for what culture becomes. What gives you hope in the midst of all that, especially for Christianity and for the church?
Yeah, just in the sort of temporal sense, like I said, the global church, what's happening is really encouraging, right? Because sometimes it's so interesting to talk to people, especially secular sort of folks in North America, and they have this idea that, oh yeah, Christianity is this kind of benighted holdover from a past bygone era, and it's just about to flicker out. Like it's just, and they're just not familiar with what's happening worldwide right now.
Right.
For the last really 30 years, like 1990s, saw the greatest ingathering into the kingdom of all of human history, like way more than the Book of Acts.
I didn't know that, but that's amazing.
Yeah, and who was that? Philip Johnson, I think is his name, one of the foremost scholars in this area, talks about that. Anyway, so yeah, we've seen like incredible things happening globally. Africa, 100 years ago, 10% of Africans are Christians. Now it's like 50%, maybe even 54 by now.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, China, some people are speculating within a generation, 1 in 3 Chinese people could be Christian.
Mm.
So we're seeing this fluorescence of faith in the world that's just tremendous. And so in many ways it's comforting, because if you have this kind of, focus on North America, it could be a little depressing. But then ultimately, what gives me hope in the midst of all the upheavals and uncertainty, and it can be disoriented, especially for, folks that are a little older, that remember the good old days, quote unquote, where Christianity was respected. It can be a little unnerving the ground is shifting under their feet so quickly. But ultimately, of course, I go back to Jesus's words. He's like, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He's saying that at a time where it looks ridiculous. He's got 12 guys in front of him, right? It's like,
right. And one of them's gonna
betray him. And, they're all over the place. And and it looks like, just a tiny little movement that's going to get snuffed out. But that's ultimately where I put my hope, right? In all the changing circumstances is Jesus' promise to build his church. And of course, we've seen that. My goodness. Now we got like 1 in 3 people on earth that claim to follow Jesus here 2,000 years later. So it's happening. It will continue to happen. And so that's a certainty, even when things look bleak.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, Drew, I want to pivot with you and maybe sharing, I don't know if this is a personal confession or what, but you've written a great book, Your Future Self Will Thank You, on self-control, habit forming, both drawing from biblical wisdom and brain science, as you say. And I'm one of those people, this is the confession, that when I pray in the mornings, I often pray through the fruit of the Spirit. God, would you, accomplish in my life? And then, there's 9 of them. And, love and joy are the first 2. And I deeply resonate with those. I want to be known as a loving and joyful person. I probably also think that just on my own ability, I can come across as loving and joyful on the whole. As soon as I hit peace and patience, I'm like, nah, I'm not so sure. And self-control is dead last. And so sometimes I even kind of forget it, if you will, but intentionally, because so I'm an Enneagram 7. And so the thought of just diving into wholeheartedly all the good things life has to offer with not holding back is quite appealing. If you had a tray of chocolate chip cookies at your house and I walked in, there's this very real part of me that wouldn't say just have one. There'd be a part of me that's if one is good, keep going.
Just have one plate.
Yeah. Right. So self-control is one of those things. And you talk about this in the book that is, it's not especially a sexy topic. It's not people are oh yeah, this.
Especially in our time. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So I wonder if you could kind of lead us in terms of, for people who are out there kind of saying seriously, they're talking about self-control now, they're ready to tune out. You begin your book with a story about your high school English teacher, Mr. Sologar.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
And a great quote from him and some of his insights, but kind of feeling the same sort of sentiment of self-control, really. So for the people out there already who are I'd rather not talk about this, or I've got a lot of failed attempts on the whole front of self-control, can you lead us in with what you learned from that teacher and what you'd say to those who are already feeling kind of discouraged on the front end of the conversation?
Yeah. Well, first thing I'd say is I'm right there with you. Yeah. I'm the same way. And it's, when it comes to books, they're either written by people that have amassed all this knowledge and expertise on a topic, and then they're going to dispense their wisdom, right? Or people that desperately need to grow in the area. And I am in the latter camp, as you know, from reading the book. This was an area I was even thinking of writing a book on this topic. I was reading all these books, secular and Christian books on the topic or around the topic of self-control. And learning a lot of things. And then all of a sudden I thought, hey, maybe there's something here for a book, because I'm one of those guys. I get all excited. I make New Year's resolutions. I always want to I'm going to start every morning by praying and read my Bible. And then I don't. I eat way too much of bad things, that kind of stuff. So yes, this was an area I was writing to myself as much as to anyone else, first of all. And you're right. Culturally, this is a tough sell. Self-control, it sounds kind of puritanical and boring or restrictive. Which is too bad, because I think from a biblical perspective, it's actually the opposite. Self-control is a virtue that enables you to have freedom, right?
Right.
Because ultimately, if you don't have self-control, you're trapped. It's slavery.
Hmm.
like all sin is, but especially self-control. And that's where that quote from my English teacher came in, Soligar. I remember him saying, let me see if I can get it from memory, but he says, whenever you lose control, someone else always finds it. And that
Hmm.
stuck with me because, and I think he was talking about like, hey, if you guys are acting up in class, you're going to be in detention, right? You lose control of your behavior, someone's going to put you in
Yeah.
detention. But the principle applies, man. You lose control and you spend too much on credit cards, then guess what? Now you're enslaved to work to pay those things off, right? If you get really crazy and break the law, you're going to be in jail. So
Hmm.
there's this principle that if you can't control yourself, that others will control you and your life will
Right.
get substantially harder. And so I think that's the counterintuitive thing about this topic is that self-control ultimately is a path to freedom.
Hmm.
And a lot of people don't understand that. They kind of they just want to express themselves. They want to indulge certain behaviors, but they don't see, and of course, as Christians, we know this, that to go down that path of kind of unrestrained fulfillment of your desires actually ends in the kind of progression that James talks about. Sin when it is full grown gives birth to death, that you end up enslaved. And so self-control is one of those fruit of the spirit, like you said, not the most popular one, but ultimately enables you to live a life of freedom and flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think of the story of like a Magic Johnson, who trained his whole
Mm,
life, tremendous discipline and self-control
right,
to be a professional basketball player, but then lack of self-control in his sexual life ultimately,
right.
shipwrecked his basketball career,
Yeah, and
and
how many leaders and dudes, especially, right, go down that path of
everything you've worked for your whole life, everything you've disciplined yourself for, yeah, being like thrown out. So let's dive into that then, Drew. Let's talk about those habits, those practices that actually fuel transformation. I've got a quote here. You write that even the most accurate, in-depth understanding of scriptural truth won't produce change in and of itself. It must be internalized and put into action. And I love that because I can be guilty of just amassing head knowledge that doesn't have any practical ramifications in my everyday life, relationships, habits, etc. So if listeners are saying, yeah, I read God's word, I'm trying to pay attention to wise teachers or role models or mentors in my life, I'm wanting to grow in this self-control, and I just haven't seen a whole lot of progress in these areas. How would you invite people to say this is how you start to internalize God's truth in a way that self-control can become second nature, almost automatic, really?
yeah. Yeah, and that's not to say, of course, that doctrine or knowledge of God is unimportant, because of course it's
Hmm.
huge, right? But as I read about this topic, I realized that I was doing some things to myself that actually set me up for failure, right? So like those New Year's resolutions I'd try every year. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to read through the Bible. I'm going to pray every morning. I'm going to do all these things. And then, oh, I'm going to run 5 miles a day and all. Yeah, I had these grandiose plans. And then I started researching this topic, and I realized I read a book about willpower, basically talking about how willpower, that is the ability to do something difficult or or resist temptation. Willpower is a finite resource. It runs
Hmm.
out, and it
Hmm.
runs out pretty quickly too.
Hmm.
So you might be able to fend off temptation once, but then second time around you're going to be weaker. And then I started reading about habits, and I realized with habits, and basically a habit is just an automatic routine, right? Usually it takes maybe anywhere from a month or two to kind of get built into your life, and then once it's a habit, it becomes a lot easier where you
Hmm.
can just do it almost without thinking, with very little effort. But what I was doing is I was trying to change in multiple core areas at once. And then that limited willpower I had just evaporated almost instantly. And I was like,
Hmm.
what? I couldn't even do this stuff for 2 weeks. What's wrong with me? Well, I was sabotaging myself, because what I should do and this is with anything, if it's spiritual, physical, you name it, is you want to start really small and you want to choose just one area. So if your thing is, hey man, I want to read my Bible every day, don't start doing that the same week you're trying to become a marathoner or you're trying to, I don't know, go on a diet or something like that. Just pick one thing and then make it really small. I've talked to a lot of people that are like, okay, I was really committed. I wanted to read like 5 chapters a day. Well, that's quite a bit, right? It's a time commitment. But if you start with just a few verses, even if you just crack your Bible every day for a month, then it becomes this routine, especially if you do it the same time every day. Maybe it's first thing in the morning, last thing at night. And then after a while, you're not thinking about it anymore. You're not saying like, hey, I should read my Bible. Your hand's just reaching for it. You're opening it. It's automatic.
Hmm.
And then you can build on that habit once it's set in place. Maybe you were reading a few verses, but now you're reading a few chapters,
Hmm.
and it becomes an ingrained part to the point where it's almost like brushing your teeth. It feels wrong if you don't do it, right?
Hmm.
And so you just have to do it. And I know that could sound a little bit, what's the word? Prosaic or something, especially when it comes to a spiritual topic, but that's just how our brains are wired. That's how God made us. And so I think it's wise to kind of think of those things as we're trying to implement some of this life change, as we're trying to convert some of the knowledge we have about God into the way that we live our lives.
Yeah.
And so like, so for instance, one of the things that I was able to change in my life was, and I'm still not, 100% consistent, but I always said to myself, hey, first thing in the morning, I'm going to start the morning reading my Bible, even if it's just a few verses. The morning would come, and then I'd reach for this thing right here. I'm holding up my phone, right? Because it was on my nightstand. And I realized I had a habit already. And the habit was to reach for my phone first thing. And I'd be like, oh, that's okay. I got a Bible app on here. I'll read the Bible in a little bit. But first, I'm going to check Twitter. Oh, and then I'm going to check my emails. Oh, someone emailed me. I got to get back to them. Next thing you know, a kid's running into my room. The day started. Guess what? I never got to the Bible. But simply by getting the phone off the nightstand, dragging my big black Bible out of retirement and plunking it down there, all of a sudden I already had a habit to reach for my phone, but now I could reach for my Bible instead. And now it's just like a little trick, really. But even small things like that can actually make a big difference in your life.
Well, and you talked too about having like a kind of a simple like reward system that you associate the completion of a task with a reward. Could you speak to that briefly, just because that really intrigued me and seemed like a good way to reinforce certain disciplines?
That's right. So yeah, every habit, and this is not me, this is, habit researchers that talk about this, but every habit has three parts. You got the cue, the thing that kind of triggers you to do it. You got the routine, that's the habit itself. And then you have a reward. So say you're wanting to become a runner. The cue might be to see your running shoes beside the door, and you go, oh, I should go for a run. Then the routine is doing the run, and maybe the reward is like just the endorphins, the runner's high, right? Sometimes there are built-in rewards like that. But when there aren't, sometimes it's good. Like, it sounds silly, but it's like, okay, if you're going to do something difficult for half an hour, give yourself a little chocolate after. And you're just, your brain can be fooled. And it's like, oh, every time I do this, something good happens, or people talk about temptation bundling, where it's like, I'm going to run on the treadmill, but I get to watch my favorite TV show. That's kind of a guilty pleasure. Well, all of a sudden you're looking forward to it because you want to watch that TV show. You're not even thinking about the fact that you're exercising. So there are little tricks you could do like that actually help cement those habits into place, which I think is important.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely, man. A few weeks ago, I put in a new deck in our backyard, and I told my wife at the outset, we're going for ice cream when this is done.
Yes.
So one of the things that really intrigued me, Drew, in reading your book was when you talked about attachment theory, which I have just scratched the surface of, really. But this whole notion that there are implications for our sense of closeness and safety and security and love from our parents that have implications for our ability to develop self-control versus feeling disconnected or unsafe or unsecure in the context of our nuclear family, or just a caregiver that we look to, that has implications for lack of discipline and self-control. And so you've done way more reading than I have in this space, but it was one of those moments where I thought, wow, this is so significant. And people always talk about, like single parent homes, or, sons being raised without fathers and different things, but I hadn't ever drawn the parallel on a spiritual level with God. And so you can run whatever direction you want to with this, but I wonder if you could explore how healthy attachment to God as a good, faithful, loving father actually can go a long way to empowering disciplined living.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, it's, usually when people talk about attachment, it's the parent-child or the guardian-child relationship. And they see how important it is for all manner of outcomes in life, right? For educational attainment, for whether someone abuses drugs and alcohol, all those kind of things. Attachment is huge, and earlier the better, right? we've all heard those horror stories of kids raised in a really difficult circumstances where no one loved them, no one was there with them. And then even if they get adopted often by a very loving parent, at 3 or 4 years old, there are lifelong struggles because of that lack of attachment. Not that they can't be overcome, but they're very, very significant challenges. And so there's an analogy with God, right? Because when we don't feel, and a lot of people, even if they say like, oh, I believe God's loving, right? And then you ask them, well, close your eyes and imagine God's face when he looks at you. And sometimes it's like a scowl, or he's just ready to whack you, or like, man, if you mess up, it's kind of the angry, disapproving sort of authoritarian figure. And sometimes it's because we haven't internalized the love of God, the grace of God, the forgiveness of God, that he truly loves us and forgives us and is pleased with us, like the Bible says. And that can have all kinds of implications for our spiritual life. One of the big things I talk about, which is this famous experiment done in, I think, the 60s, was it? The marshmallow experiment, where they tested kids' self-control. It's kind of a cruel thing, but they put these like 3 and 4-year-olds in a room with a marshmallow or some other tasty snack on this table and said, okay, you can't eat it. Or I think they said, you can eat it right away, but if you wait 20 minutes, you get like 2 snacks, right? And so they're trying to test how self-controlled these kids are. Of course, most kids just grabbed it right away. They just can't hold out. It's just, and it's funny. You read about the experiment, and like some of the kids that held out a little bit did all these things to distract themselves. They'd like tug on their hair, or like look away, or grab the marshmallow and pet it like it was a little pet. Anyway, and then the real importance of the experiment came to light years later when they followed up these same kids and found that the ones that could withhold taking the marshmallow right away had these way better life outcomes, and the ones that couldn't resist had poor life outcomes. And then, interestingly, years later, quite recently, as I recall, someone ran the experiment, but instead of having just like a experimenter that didn't know the children doing it, they had like a loving parent doing it versus someone that they didn't know or weren't attached to. And when it was a loving parent conducting the research, the kids could hold out much longer. They demonstrated way greater self-control. And it makes sense, right? Because the kid's sitting there and going, I love and trust this person. They want what's best for me. They have my back. I want to please them. Furthermore, I know that they're good for the second marshmallow if I hold out, right? And so that showed that actually that attachment is essential for exercising self-control. And I think there's a corollary in the spiritual life. When we trust God, when we get the idea that God forgives us into our bones, then we don't want to just sin as much as we can, get away with stuff, right? We want to practice self-control and to live a holy life that pleases God, because we have that healthy attachment to God. So yeah, I thought that was interesting, and just shows how important our conceptualization of God is for this topic, among others.
Yeah. Well, continuing to explore this topic, what would you say the church can learn from Alcoholics Anonymous about confronting and subduing addiction?
Yeah, a lot, just because, and I don't know a lot about Alcoholics Anonymous, but I was researching it when I wrote my book. And their first thing, they have all the steps, but their first thing is that, and I'm going to butcher it, but like they have to say, we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. Right? Those are the two, we're powerless and unmanageable. And it's so interesting because if I was inventing a program to help people quit alcohol, maybe I'd start with something a little more positive, right? Like, oh, we realized that we were rock stars and we could do anything if we just summoned our inner strength and blah, blah, like,
Like
I mean, and that's the way that's the way a lot of self-help reads. That's a lot of, how people think they can overcome problems. But no, if you go into AA, you got to humble yourself. You're like, no, I'm here. I'm desperate. I can't do this on my own, right? And it's so interesting because that's the starting point for Christians. You can't come to Christ and be like, yeah, I got all this, Jesus, I'm going to put you, I'll add you onto my life. But you got to be like, I'm helpless. I'm a sinner. I'm in need of grace, right? And I think there's something powerful in that admission. First of all, it's reality, because you can't do it yourself. We're all sinners. And then, so you have this sober awareness of your sinful nature, right? And then you're confessing your dependence and your need of help. So that's huge. And then, of course, with alcoholics, you don't come, if someone comes to an AA meeting, even if they've been going for a few years, and they're like, hey, guess what? My name's Drew. I'm no longer an alcoholic. I got over it. I think I licked it, right? They're like, oh no, this guy's going down, right? Because that's the first thing they do. Hi, I'm Drew and I'm an alcoholic.
Mhm.
I'm not, but anyway, I'm,
For the sake of illustration.
for the sake of illustration, fortunately, I've dodged that vice. But yeah, they understand that forever you confess that. And there's something powerful in that. And not just for alcohol, whatever your besetting sin or addiction is, to kind of admit it, confess it. Confession is healthy for the soul, right? Bring it to God. You get the forgiveness. You get that blank slate, that clean start. And that's powerful. And then this is the biggest thing when it comes to AA or any successful recovery program: community. That's the secret sauce. That's, you don't go, you know what, I'm an alcoholic, but I'm going to get over this, but I'm going to do it by myself. I think I got this, right? I'm going to keep myself accountable. Like, no, right? You're
Doesn't
a
work that
sitting
way.
duck, right? Same thing with being a Christian. If you want to grow in any area of your life, if you want to exhibit more self-control, you need others. We're not, lone rangers or dead rangers when it comes to this topic. So whatever the vice is, if it's eating, if it's pornography, if it's shopping too much, if it's, whatever it is, what I encourage people to do is to get a group, preferably of people who kind of have similar struggles, but who are experiencing some victory, who can help you and encourage you and keep you accountable. And that's powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes, man, I have a few friends who are part of AA, and there's moments where I just think, wow, imagine if there was just if 9 out of 10 churches were able to cultivate that culture of openness and honesty and grace and support.
Right.
It, yeah, makes me jealous, but also hopeful. Because I know so many AA communities do that so well. So,
Yep.
well, speaking of those that we love who have navigated addiction, and something that I think brought a lot of depth to what you're writing about, Drew, is sharing a personal story of your brother Dave, who's battled addiction. It brought everything you've been writing about self-control into a deeper light. Just appreciating, for me as a reader, what you've experienced as you journey alongside him. And so I want to ask for people listening in who've heard this whole conversation on self-control, they're wanting to grow in this way personally, and this reality of a family member who's really battled addiction is very real for them, or for someone in their friend group that they're close to. I wonder, could you speak to how that experience in your personal life has shaped your perspective towards self-control, but also your heart towards those who have struggled to overcome dysfunctional habits in their lives?
Sure. Yeah. So I have 3 older brothers, no sisters. I was supposed to be the girl. Big disappointment. I was going to be Darla. Anyway,
Wow.
that's a whole nother therapy session. But my oldest brother, Dave, great guy in many ways, brilliant dude, was a successful businessman. And then over the span of maybe 10 years, his life basically came crashing down through various addictions, gambling, drugs. And it culminated in this bizarre episode where he was arrested and had 64 counts against him. He was involved in all kinds of criminal activities. Anyway, he was on what's the Canadian Crime Stoppers, right? Is that yeah, it's like America's Most Wanted, I think, Crime Stoppers.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it ended up being the best thing for him, because he did get some jail time, and it was wild because I wrote about him in my book, and when you write about someone in your book, you got to get permission, especially if you know them, to use their story. And so I had to send him a form, which he signed. He was really gracious about it, and fine with me sharing his story. But I had to send it to him in prison where he signed it, and it just basically a couple things. I'm sometimes tempted to think like, oh well, some people have serious struggles, but that's not me, right? I grew up in the church. I've been a Christian since an early age, and but if we're honest, there is the potential for sin, addiction in all of us, right? Even serious addiction. And so that was sobering, first of all, to think of that. So it was a bit of a cautionary tale for me, honestly. And then just have some compassion for people that go through these kinds of struggles, knowing that often it strikes close to home. And the other thing to me was looking at my brother's life. There were little compromises, little things that could be considered small that he indulged in earlier in life. And at the time, they might not seem like a big deal. But often, when you don't nip that in the bud, they build into bigger things, right? I think we've all seen instances of this in our own lives as well. And so it was just a good reminder of me to be vigilant. I think it's the Puritan John Owen who said, be killing sin or it will be killing you, right? It's like you have to have a vision, and not to be legalistic or anything like that, but just not to be like, oh yeah, I lie a little bit here. I cheat on my taxes. I look at some porn, but I don't have affairs. It's easy to excuse your sins thinking that they'll kind of stay that size, but they don't often, right? They get bigger, they get unmanageable. And all of a sudden at a point, your volition's taken out of the equation and you're enslaved. So yeah, that was kind of an important story for me to share, just because it can show how far things go. Now, I'm pleased to report Dave's out of jail. He is he's clean. He's clean and he's doing good. Of course, there's, with people that have traveled this path with family members that are addicts, you're always kind of crossing your fingers and praying because there can be relapses and things. But it's been a few years now that Dave's been clean, and so we're thankful to God for that and proud of him. Fortunately, that story, at least at this point, has a happy ending, so we're grateful for that. But yeah, just a sober reminder that sin doesn't, what's the expression? It takes you farther than you wanted to go, faster than you wanted to get there. That's so true.
Yeah. And self-control is something that we'll never master, but always want to pursue practicing in our everyday lives. So yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that honesty. I realize that's a account that's close to home. But Drew, for people listening in who, are appreciating what you're sharing, wanting to learn more, wanting to pick up a coffee of, your future self will thank you, or just, connect with you on Twitter or your website, where could they connect with you or pick up a copy of your book?
Oh, well, every author likes that question.
Yes.
There's a little company called Amazon.com.
Never heard of it.
No, maybe Amazon.ca. Sorry, I got to translate it.
That's appreciate it.
That's probably the quickest way to get it. Or you can walk into a bookstore and look for it, and if it's not there, throw a big fit, start tipping over tables and say, why aren't you carrying Drew's book? No, that obviously I'm always honored when someone other than your mom reads your book. She has to. And yeah, as far as connecting with me, if you're in the Northwest, man, stop by. We'll grab some good coffee. Okay. I spend too much time on Twitter. I'll be honest, trying to exercise self-control better there. My wife, Grace, calls it my mistress, but yeah, so you can connect with me there. It's just my name, Drew Dyck, DREWDYCK. Yeah.
And drewdyck.com, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yes. And my website that I probably need to update at some point, but you know how that is.
Some great articles on there too. Hey, this has been a sweet gift to have this chance to chat with you, Drew. So thanks for everything you've shared, for what you're writing, and all the best as you continue to write and share thoughtful content with the world.
Hey, thank you. It's been a pleasure.